The elderly couple who witnessed everything became regular speakers at community police forums, sharing their perspective on the importance of standing up for what's right. Their story of speaking out against injustice inspired others to do the same. 6 months later, the department's annual review showed measurable improvements in community relations and officer conduct. The Quick Stop incident, while unfortunate, had sparked necessary changes in training, accountability, and community engagement. Sometimes karma works in unexpected ways, Johnson reflected during a department meeting. What could have been just another negative headline became a catalyst for positive change. It reminded us that we're all responsible for creating the kind of law enforcement community we want to serve in. The incident remained in the department's training materials, serving as a powerful reminder that true justice requires constant vigilance against bias and prejudice. The karma that Officer Miller earned that day didn't just affect him, it helped transform an entire department's approach to service and justice. As life at Quick Stop returned to normal, the lessons learned continued to resonate. The store became known not just as the place where an incident of bias occurred, but as the place where a community came together to stand up for justice and dignity. In the end, karma had worked not just as punishment, but as a teacher, guiding the way toward positive change. In the weeks following the incident at Quick Stop, the ripple effects of that evening spread far beyond the small convenience store. The morning after, Sheriff Johnson arrived at her office to find her email inbox overflowing with messages of support from fellow officers, community members, and law enforcement agencies across the country. The videos recorded by the teenage boys had gone viral, reaching millions of views across social media platforms. News outlets picked up the story, highlighting not just the incident itself, but Johnson's professional response and the swift action taken by the department. The headlines painted a picture of both the ongoing challenges in law enforcement and the possibility of positive change. "Mom, you're trending," Johnson's younger daughter had exclaimed over breakfast that first morning, scrolling through her phone. The family had spent the evening talking about what happened, turning a difficult situation into a teaching moment about dignity, justice, and the power of maintaining composure under pressure. The department's response to the incident was comprehensive and swift. Within the first week, Captain Thomas had implemented mandatory cross-agency recognition training for all officers. The training sessions used security footage and body camera video from the Quick Stop incident as a case study, sparking honest discussions about bias and professionalism. Officer Miller's disciplinary hearing revealed a pattern of similar, though less severe, incidents in his previous position. The psychological evaluation highlighted unconscious biases that had never been properly addressed. Rather than simply punishing him, the department required him to undergo extensive training and counseling. "It's not about destroying careers," Johnson explained during a department-wide meeting. "It's about recognizing our biases and actively working to overcome them. Every officer needs to understand that our badge comes with both authority and responsibility." Mr. Chen's convenience store became an unexpected symbol of community solidarity. Regular customers brought flowers and thank you cards, expressing their appreciation for how the store owners handled the situation. Local business associations recognized them for their role in promoting justice and community relations. The teenage boys who recorded the incident were honored at a community council meeting. Their quick thinking and willingness to document the truth had helped ensure accountability. They were offered internships with the department's community outreach program, turning their interest in justice into potential career paths. Johnson received numerous speaking invitations from police academies and law enforcement conferences. Her handling of the situation became a model for professional response to bias incidents. She accepted some of these invitations, seeing them as opportunities to contribute to necessary changes in law enforcement culture. "Real change happens through education and understanding," she explained to a group of police cadets. "We need to acknowledge our biases, confront them openly, and work actively to ensure they don't affect our judgment on the job." The young mother who witnessed everything brought her toddler to visit Johnson at her office. "I wanted my daughter to meet someone who handles tough situations with such grace," she explained, tears in her eyes. "You've shown us what real leadership looks like." The department's new training protocols gained attention from law enforcement agencies nationwide. Other departments began implementing similar programs, using the Quick Stop incident as a launching point for their own discussions about bias and professional conduct. Officer Miller, after completing his required training and counseling, wrote a lengthy apology letter that demonstrated genuine understanding of his actions' impact. "I let assumptions cloud my judgment and forgot the fundamental principles of our profession," he wrote. "I'm committed to learning from this mistake and becoming a better officer." 3 months after the incident, Quick Stop hosted a community gathering. Officers mingled with local residents, sharing coffee and conversation. The event symbolized the ongoing work of building trust between law enforcement and the community they serve. Johnson's daughters noticed changes in their mother too. "You've always been strong," her older daughter said one evening, "but now everyone else sees it too." The incident had transformed their family discussions about justice and equality from abstract concepts to lived experience. The elderly couple who had witnessed everything from the beginning finally prepared to leave. The woman paused by Johnson's side, patting her arm gently. "You showed real strength today, dear. Not just in handling the situation, but in turning it into something positive." As the formal proceedings concluded, Miller was escorted out by Lieutenant Rodriguez. The young officer's shoulders slumped under the weight of his actions and their consequences. The karma he had earned through his prejudiced behavior had manifested swiftly and decisively. The internal affairs investigators began packing up their materials, having collected hours of statements and evidence. One of them approached Johnson with a business card. "We'll need you to come in tomorrow to provide a detailed statement, Sheriff. But for now, go home to your family." Mr. and Mrs. Chen began preparing to finally close their store nearly 4 hours later than usual. Captain Thomas assured them they would be compensated for their lost business and cooperation with the investigation. The teenage boys, preparing to leave with their viral videos and witness statements, stopped by Johnson one last time. "Sheriff, thanks for showing us how to handle tough situations with dignity. That was a real lesson for everyone." As the night drew to a close, the Quick Stop began to return to its normal state. The police vehicles gradually departed, the news vans packed up, and the curious onlookers dispersed. What remained was a powerful lesson about justice, consequences, and the importance of confronting bias in all its forms. The karma that Officer Miller had earned would continue to unfold in the days and weeks to come, but its immediate impact was clear. His actions had sparked a necessary conversation and would lead to meaningful changes in department policy and training. Sometimes, the best lessons come from the most unexpected and uncomfortable situations. As the digital clocks in Quick Stop blinked to 8:45 p.m., the resolution of the incident began to take shape. Captain Thomas stood in the center of the store, which had remained closed to regular customers for the past few hours. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows as he prepared to address the situation formally. After reviewing all available evidence, including witness statements, security footage, body camera video, and social media posts, "We're taking immediate action," Captain Thomas announced to the assembled group. His voice carried the weight of authority and finality. Officer Miller, who had been sitting quietly in a corner under supervision, was called forward. His uniform, crisp and intimidating just hours ago, now seemed to hang loosely on his shoulders. Lieutenant Rodriguez stood beside him, holding a formal letter in his hands. "Officer Miller," Captain Thomas began, his tone firm but controlled, "effective immediately, you are placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation by Internal Affairs. You will surrender your department credentials, and you are required to attend a disciplinary hearing next week." The young officer's face drained of color as the captain continued listing the consequences of his actions. The teenage boys who had recorded everything were still present, having stayed to give their official statements. They exchanged knowing looks. Their videos had already gathered thousands of views online. Furthermore, the captain added, "You will be required to complete comprehensive bias training and undergo a full psychological evaluation before any consideration of reinstatement." The words hung heavy in the air, each one another brick in the wall of consequences Miller had built for himself. Sheriff Johnson, who had remained at the scene despite multiple offers to leave, stepped forward. Her presence commanded attention even after the exhausting events of the day. "Captain, if I may," she asked, her voice steady and clear. "Of course, Sheriff," Captain Thomas responded, stepping aside to give her the floor. Johnson turned to face Miller directly. "Officer, what happened here today goes beyond a simple mistake in judgment. Your actions reflect a deeper issue that exists within law enforcement, one that we must address openly and honestly." The store fell silent as she continued, every person present understanding they were witnessing an important moment. Even Mr. Chen, who had been counting the day's losses from his closed store, stopped to listen. "I'm not interested in destroying your career," Johnson stated firmly. "But I am interested in ensuring that what happened today becomes a learning opportunity for every officer in both our departments. This isn't just about you and me, it's about every person who wears the badge and every citizen we serve." Miller, who had barely spoken since his superior officers arrived, finally found his voice. "Sheriff Johnson, I don't know what to say. I made assumptions that were completely unfair and unprofessional. I failed to follow basic procedures because of my own biases." His voice cracked slightly as he spoke. The internal affairs investigators were taking detailed notes, their pens scratching against paper in the quiet store. One of them spoke up. "Officer Miller, you'll need to provide a full written statement describing your actions and decision-making process during this incident." Captain Thomas then turned to address the witnesses who had stayed throughout the evening. "Your cooperation and quick thinking helped ensure the situation was properly documented and addressed. Thank you for standing up for what's right." The young mother, who had remained to give her statement, smiled tiredly. Her toddler had long since fallen asleep in a makeshift bed made from shopping baskets and soft merchandise, a small kindness arranged by Mrs. Chen. "Sheriff Johnson," Captain Thomas continued, "the department will be issuing a formal apology, both privately and publicly. We'll also be reviewing all our training procedures and implementing new protocols for cross-agency recognition." Johnson nodded appreciatively but added, "What I'd really like to see is this incident used as a case study in training. Not just the mistake, but the response, how the community came together, how the department acted swiftly, and how we can all learn from this." The internal affairs investigators had moved their focus to examining Miller's record. His personnel file was being pulled up, previous complaints reviewed, and his training history scrutinized. Each new piece of information would help determine the consequences of his actions. Outside, local news vans had begun to arrive, drawn by the social media buzz and the unusual number of police vehicles at the store. Captain Thomas immediately dispatched officers to establish a perimeter, protecting the integrity of the investigation and the privacy of those involved. The sun had almost set now, casting long shadows through the store windows. The fluorescent lights seemed brighter in the growing darkness, illuminating a scene that would likely become a case study in police training programs: how unconscious bias could lead to serious misconduct, and how quickly karma could catch up to those who acted on their prejudices. Mr. Chen had finally finished showing the security footage to the investigators. The cameras had captured everything from multiple angles, providing clear evidence of Miller's unnecessary escalation and Johnson's professional response. The footage would become crucial evidence in the investigation that would follow. As Captain Thomas coordinated with Internal Affairs about next steps, Johnson's phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from her older daughter. "Mom, I'm so proud of how you handled that. You're showing everyone what real leadership looks like." Despite the stress of the day, Johnson smiled, knowing that even this difficult situation was teaching her daughters valuable lessons about dignity, professionalism, and justice. The karma that Officer Miller had earned was still unfolding, but its effects were already clear. His actions had not only jeopardized his own career, but had also sparked a conversation about bias that would resonate throughout the department and the community. As the investigation continued into the night, it was evident that this incident would lead to significant changes in how the department approached training, supervision, and community relations. The Quick Stop's parking lot was now filled with police vehicles when Captain Thomas pulled up in his unmarked car. His arrival marked a significant shift in the atmosphere. As the highest-ranking officer on scene and Johnson's direct supervisor, his presence carried the weight of authority and imminent consequences. Captain Thomas, a tall man with graying hair and 30 years of experience etched on his face, strode into the store with purpose. He had been in a budget meeting when the calls and texts started flooding in about one of his top sheriffs being handcuffed at a convenience store. The moment he heard it was Johnson, he knew something had gone terribly wrong. Sheriff Johnson, he called out as he entered, his voice carrying both concern and authority. Are you all right? His eyes quickly scanned the scene, taking in the gathering of officers, the internal affairs investigators, and Officer Miller's increasingly distressed state. I'm fine, Captain, Johnson replied professionally, though the emotional toll of the incident was beginning to show in her tired eyes. Just an unfortunate misunderstanding that escalated unnecessarily. Her diplomatic response spoke volumes about her character, even in the face of such blatant disrespect. The store had become a hub of activity. Internal affairs investigators were reviewing security footage with Mr. Chen at the counter, while other officers continued taking statements from witnesses. The teenage boys who had recorded everything were now showing their videos to Captain Thomas on their phones. This is unacceptable, Captain Thomas muttered as he watched the footage, his jaw tightening with each passing second. He turned to Lieutenant Rodriguez, who stood nearby. I want a full report on my desk by morning. Every detail, every witness statement, every piece of video evidence. The young mother who had witnessed everything approached Captain Thomas, but Tubler now sleeping against her shoulder. Sir, I need you to know that Sheriff Johnson was completely professional throughout this whole thing. Even when she was being handcuffed, she stayed calm and tried to de-escalate the situation. Captain Thomas nodded, making notes as the woman spoke. More witnesses came forward, each adding their perspective to the growing narrative. The elderly couple described how Miller had ignored Johnson's badge and ID. The delivery driver explained how he'd immediately recognized something was wrong and called for help. Officer Miller stood near the door, looking increasingly ill as he watched his career potentially unraveling before his eyes. His superior officers had already collected his badge and firearm, standard procedure during an internal affairs investigation. We need your body camera footage as well, one of the internal affairs investigators told Miller. And your dash cam if it captured anything before you entered the store. Miller nodded weakly, knowing that his own equipment would provide even more evidence of his misconduct. Meanwhile, Johnson's phone buzzed with a message from her youngest daughter. Mom, are you okay? It's all over social media. The teenage boy's videos had already begun circulating online, drawing attention to yet another incident of racial profiling in law enforcement. Captain Thomas approached Johnson again, this time with a more personal concern. Maria, I know you're handling this with incredible grace, but don't feel you need to stay here any longer. Go home to your girls. We'll handle everything from here. Johnson considered his offer, looking around at the scene that had developed from her simple shopping trip. The store's regular evening customers were being turned away, the investigation taking precedence over business as usual. Mrs. Chen had been quietly making coffee for the officers, her way of maintaining some normalcy in the chaos. Sir, I think I should stay, Johnson replied. My presence here sends a message, and my perspective will be important for the report. She glanced at Miller, who seemed to shrink further under her gaze. Besides, this could be a valuable teaching moment for the department. The internal affairs investigators had moved on to interviewing Miller, whose responses seemed to grow weaker with each question. His face had taken on a grayish tinge as the full impact of his actions and their potential consequences began to sink in. Lieutenant Rodriguez approached Johnson, his face a mix of embarrassment and concern. Sheriff, I can't begin to apologize enough for this incident. I assure you this will be dealt with appropriately. Johnson nodded, knowing that her response in this moment would help shape how the department handled similar situations in the future. One of the teenage boys who had been recording approached Johnson cautiously. Sheriff, we've already uploaded the videos. People need to see this kind of thing when it happens. She thanked him for his quick thinking, recognizing that sometimes transparency was the best path to change. As the sun began to set outside, casting long shadows through the store windows, the quick stop had become more than just the scene of an incident. It had become a testimony to community solidarity, to the importance of truth, and to the ongoing need for awareness and change in law enforcement. The karma that Officer Miller had earned through his prejudiced actions was unfolding in real time, witnessed by a community that had come together to stand up for what was right. As Internal Affairs continued their interviews and evidence collection, it was clear that this incident would have lasting implications for both Miller's career and the department's approach to bias training. The quick stop had transformed from a simple convenience store into what felt like a courthouse, with every witness eager to share what they had seen. The teenage boys who had been recording approached Lieutenant Rodriguez, their phones extended like evidence in a trial. "Sir, we got everything on video," one of them said, his voice carrying a mix of excitement and concern. "From the moment he started harassing Sheriff Johnson, we got multiple angles too." The lieutenant nodded appreciatively, taking down their contact information for the inevitable investigation. The young mother, who had been quietly recording from the corner, stepped forward while gently bouncing her now calm toddler. "The sheriff was just shopping," she explained, her voice trembling with emotion. "She was looking at school supplies when this officer came in and started making accusations. She showed her badge, but he wouldn't even look at it." Mr. Chen had recovered his composure and was now providing his own detailed account to one of the responding officers. "Sheriff Johnson has been coming here for years," he explained, gesturing to the security cameras mounted in the corners. "We have everything on our store cameras too. She was just buying supplies for her daughters, like she always does." Mrs. Chen had brought out a chair from the back room, offering it to Johnson, who politely declined. Instead, the sheriff stood tall, maintaining her professional demeanor even as witness after witness came forward to describe the incident. Her presence commanded respect, making Officer Miller's actions seem even more ridiculous in retrospect. The elderly couple who had witnessed everything from the greeting card aisle provided their perspective to another officer. The way he spoke to her was completely unacceptable, the elderly woman insisted, her husband nodding in agreement. "We've seen Sheriff Johnson at community meetings. She's done so much for this neighborhood." This young officer didn't even give her a chance to explain. Outside, more patrol cars had arrived, their lights creating a kaleidoscope of red and blue that spilled through the store windows. Curious onlookers had begun to gather in the parking lot, drawn by the unusual number of police vehicles at the small store. Lieutenant Rodriguez was on his phone now, speaking in clipped tones to someone who was clearly higher up the chain of command. "Yes, sir." Officer Miller handcuffed Sheriff Johnson without cause. "No, sir, he didn't check her credentials." "Yes, sir, multiple witnesses and video evidence. Internal Affairs is en route." The delivery driver who had witnessed the end of the incident returned, adding his account to the growing testimony. "I've delivered to this store for 3 years," he explained to the officers. "Sheriff Johnson stops here all the time. Everyone knows her. When I saw what was happening, I called 911 right away." Johnson's own phone had been buzzing continuously in her pocket. News traveled fast in law enforcement circles, and her fellow officers were already reaching out to check on her. She took a moment to send a quick text to her daughters, letting them know she'd be home later than planned. Miller stood near the entrance, looking increasingly uncomfortable as each witness came forward. His earlier confidence had completely evaporated, replaced by the stark realization of his mistake. Every few minutes, he would glance at Johnson, as if trying to figure out how he had misjudged the situation so badly. 2 Internal Affairs investigators arrived, their presence adding another layer of seriousness to the scene. They immediately began conducting preliminary interviews, their notepads filling quickly with witness statements. The teenage boys eagerly showed them their video footage, which clearly captured Miller's aggressive approach and refusal to verify Johnson's identity. The store's regular customers continued to arrive, only to stop short at the scene unfolding inside. Many recognized Johnson and stayed to add their voices to the chorus of support. "She helped my son when he was having trouble at school," one woman volunteered. "She's always looking out for our community." Johnson finally accepted a bottle of water from Mrs. Chen, the simple act of kindness almost bringing tears to her eyes. The events of the last hour had been more draining than she'd let on, but she maintained her composure, knowing that her response to this situation would set an example for her department. The sound of approaching sirens filled the air, growing louder by the second. Red and blue lights began to flash across the store's windows, creating an almost surreal atmosphere in the small space. Miller froze, still holding Johnson's arm, as multiple police vehicles pulled into the parking lot. "I suggest you remove these handcuffs now," Johnson said calmly. It will look better for you if I'm not in restraints when your superior officer arrives. She could feel Miller's indecision in the way his grip alternately tightened and loosened on her arm. The teenage boys who had been recording moved closer to the windows, capturing the arrival of what appeared to be half the police department. Through the glass, Johnson could see several officers she recognized from morning briefings rushing toward the store entrance. The electronic bell chimed one final time as Lieutenant Rodriguez burst through the door, followed by two senior officers. The lieutenant took in the scene in one quick glance: the handcuffed sheriff, the recording customers, the distraught store owners, and his increasingly uncomfortable officer. Miller. Rodriguez's voice cracked like a whip through the store. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" "Release Sheriff Johnson immediately." The lieutenant's face was a mask of barely contained fury as he watched his junior officer fumble with the handcuff keys. As Miller's trembling hands worked to remove the cuffs, Johnson maintained her professional demeanor, though she could feel the eyes of every person in the store on her. The clicking sound of the handcuffs being removed seemed to echo in the now silent space. Johnson rubbed her wrists gently as she turned to face Miller, who seemed to have shrunk several inches under the withering glare of his lieutenant. The young officer's face had gone from pale to bright red, and sweat had begun to bead on his forehead. The situation had escalated far beyond a simple misunderstanding, becoming instead a perfect example of the biases and assumptions that continued to plague law enforcement. As Johnson looked around at the faces of the witnesses, concerned, angry, relieved, she knew this incident would have repercussions far beyond this small convenience store. Lieutenant Rodriguez had already begun speaking into his radio, requesting a supervisor from Internal Affairs to respond to the scene. Miller stood rooted to the spot, his earlier bravado completely evaporated as the reality of his actions began to sink in. The karma he had earned through his prejudiced assumptions was about to be served, and it would be swift and significant. The situation at Quick Stop spiraled further as Officer Miller began to escort Sheriff Johnson toward the front of the store. The handcuffs bit uncomfortably into her wrists, but she held her head high, maintaining the same dignity she taught her deputies to show even in difficult situations. The other customers watched in stunned silence, their phones still recording every moment of the unfolding drama. "I need to call this in," Miller announced, reaching for his radio with his free hand. His voice carried a slight tremor now, perhaps finally registering the gravity of his actions. Before he could complete the call, Johnson spoke up, her voice clear and controlled despite the circumstances. "Officer Miller, you really should check my credentials before this goes any further. There are at least 12 witnesses here who can verify my identity." Her calm tone contrasted sharply with Miller's increasingly agitated state. Several of the onlookers nodded in agreement, and Mr. Chen stepped forward once again. "Please, officer, just look at her ID. I've known Sheriff Johnson for 15 years. She helps our community, she protects our neighborhood." Mr. Chen's voice shook with emotion as he watched one of his most respected customers being treated like a common criminal. Miller's radio crackled to life before he could respond. "Unit 247, what's your status at Quick Stop?" The dispatcher's voice filled the tense silence. Miller hesitated for a moment, then keyed his radio. "I have a suspect in custody, possible law enforcement impersonation. Requesting backup for transport." The elderly couple who had been examining greeting cards earlier had moved closer to Johnson. The woman spoke up, her voice quavering but determined. "Young man, we've seen this officer, this sheriff, at community meetings. She's the real deal. What you're doing isn't right." Johnson could feel Miller's grip on her arm tighten slightly at these words. The tension in the store was becoming unbearable. The young mother in the corner was trying to quiet her fussy toddler while still recording the scene. The teenage boys had spread out, capturing the incident from different angles. "Ma'am, please be quiet," Miller snapped at the elderly woman. "This is a police matter, and I need everyone to step back." His voice carried a note of desperation now, as if he was trying to maintain control of a situation that was rapidly slipping away from him. Just then, the store's bell chimed again. A delivery driver walked in, took one look at the scene, and immediately backed out. Through the store's front windows, Johnson could see him pulling out his phone, likely adding to the number of calls already made to emergency services. The radio crackled again, this time with a different voice. Unit 247, be advised, Lieutenant Rodriguez is en route to your location. Hold your position. Miller's face visibly paled at this announcement. Lieutenant Rodriguez was known throughout the local police department for his no-nonsense approach to proper procedure. Officer, Johnson said quietly, I assume you're new to this jurisdiction. I understand being vigilant, but this has gone far enough. When your lieutenant arrives, this situation will become much more complicated for you. Her words carried no threat, just a simple statement of fact. Miller's response was to tug her toward the door. We'll sort this out at the station, he insisted, though his voice had lost much of its earlier authority. The customers parted to make way, their phones following the movement. Mrs. Chen had begun to cry softly, while her husband made another phone call, speaking rapidly in Chinese. Miller shot Mr. Chen a dismissive look. Stay out of this, sir. This is police business. He took another step toward Johnson, handcuffs now in his free hand. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across his face, highlighting the tension in his jaw and the rigid set of his shoulders. Johnson's mind raced through her options. As a law enforcement officer, she knew the dangers of escalating such situations. As a sheriff, she was technically Miller's superior, but any sudden movement could make things worse. As a mother, she thought of her daughters at home, waiting for her to return with school supplies. Officer, I'm going to slowly reach for my department ID, Johnson announced, her voice projecting the authority she'd earned through years of service. I understand your concern for officer safety, but this situation is completely unnecessary. The young mother with the toddler had retreated to the far corner of the store, trying to keep her child quiet while watching the scene unfold with wide eyes. The teenage boys had positioned themselves near the drinks cooler, their phones steady as they captured every moment. Miller's response was to step even closer, his face flushed with either embarrassment or anger, possibly both. Any ID you show could be fake. We've had reports of sophisticated law enforcement impersonators in the area. The excuse sounded hollow even as he said it. The electronic bell above the door chimed again, and two more customers walked in, immediately sensing the tension. They stopped short, taking in the scene. A uniformed police officer confronting a well-dressed black woman, while other customers recorded with their phones and store owners looked on in distress. This is my last warning, Miller declared, his voice rising. Put your hands behind your back, or I'll add resisting arrest to the charges. The handcuffs jingled in his grip, a metallic sound that seemed to echo in the now-silent store. Johnson's training told her that sometimes the best way to handle a situation is to let it play out through proper channels. She knew backup would arrive soon, either called by dispatch monitoring Miller's radio traffic or by one of the many witnesses who surely had called 911 by now. Under protest, I'll comply, Johnson stated clearly, her voice carrying to all the recording phones, but I want everyone here to witness that I'm a sheriff being wrongfully detained while carrying full identification. She slowly turned, maintaining her dignity even as Miller roughly grabbed her wrists. The handcuffs clicked shut, and in that moment, the store's atmosphere changed from tense observation to quiet outrage. Mrs. Chen had tears in her eyes, while her husband was already on the phone, presumably calling someone who could help. The teenage boys had moved closer, making sure to capture clear footage of Johnson's badge and Miller's actions. As Miller began reciting the Miranda rights, his voice carried a note of uncertainty, as if he was finally starting to realize he might have made a serious mistake. But like many who find themselves too deep in an error of judgment, he seemed determined to see it through. The late afternoon sun continued to stream through the store's windows, its warm light a stark contrast to the cold metal of the handcuffs and the even colder reality of what was unfolding. In just a few minutes, this routine stop for school supplies had transformed into a clear example of the prejudices that still plagued law enforcement. Little did Miller know that his next few minutes would completely change the trajectory of his career, as karma was already in motion, speeding toward the quick stop in the form of several police vehicles with lights flashing. The sharp voice that cut through the peaceful atmosphere of quick stop belonged to Officer James Miller, who had just walked in with heavy, purposeful steps. He was new to the local police department, having transferred from a small town upstate just 3 months ago. His pressed blue uniform and polished badge gleamed under the fluorescent lights, but his demeanor was anything but professional. "Hey you, don't move," Miller barked, his hand instinctively moving to rest on his holster. The other customers in the store froze, startled by the sudden hostile tone. Johnson turned slowly, her years of training kicking in as she maintained a calm exterior despite her rising concern. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked steadily, her badge clearly visible on her belt. The fluorescent lights caught the gold shield, making it impossible to miss. Mr. Chen, who had been in the middle of bagging Johnson's items, stopped mid-motion, his eyes darting between the two law enforcement officers. Miller's face twisted with suspicion as he took 2 aggressive steps forward. "I've been watching you through the window. Your behavior seems suspicious. You've been wandering the aisles, picking up items, looking around constantly." His voice dripped with accusation, completely ignoring or choosing not to see the badge on her hip. The elderly couple by the greeting cards slowly backed away, while Mrs. Chen moved closer to her husband behind the counter. The teenage boys who had been by the slushy machine pulled out their phones, sensing that something significant was unfolding. "Officer, I think there's been a misunderstanding," Johnson replied calmly, her training in de-escalation guiding her response. "I'm Sheriff Maria Johnson from Riverside County." She moved her hand slowly toward her badge, making her movements deliberate and non-threatening. Miller's reaction was immediate and excessive. "Don't reach for anything," he shouted, fully unholstering his weapon but keeping it pointed downward. The atmosphere in the store instantly became electric with tension. A collective gasp went up from the other customers, and the sound of more phones being pulled out to record filled the air. "Sir, I'm reaching for my badge," Johnson continued, her voice steady despite the adrenaline now coursing through her system. "I've been shopping here for years. Mr. Chen can verify my identity." She kept her hands visible, years of experience helping her maintain composure in this surreal situation. But Miller seemed beyond reason. A real sheriff wouldn't be dressed like that, shopping in this neighborhood. His implications hung heavy in the air. "Put your hands behind your back. You're under arrest for suspicious behavior and impersonating a law enforcement officer." The absurdity of the situation might have been almost comical if it weren't so dangerous and degrading. Johnson, who had spent the morning leading a department briefing and the afternoon reviewing case files, was now being accused of impersonating herself. "Officer Miller," Mr. Chen interjected, his voice shaking slightly but determined, "she is telling the truth. Sheriff Johnson has been coming to my store for many years. She is definitely who she says she is." The memories of her own journey flashed through her mind as she reached for her favorite energy drink. She remembered her first day at the academy, the skeptical looks, the whispered doubts. But she'd proved them all wrong, graduating at the top of her class and rising through the ranks through sheer determination and exceptional service. Johnson's radio crackled softly, a habit she couldn't break, staying connected to her team even off-duty. She adjusted the volume lower, not wanting to disturb other shoppers. The familiar voices discussing routine patrols reminded her of the larger family she'd built within the department. Her fellow officers were more than colleagues, they were partners in serving and protecting their community. Standing in line at the counter, Johnson pulled out her phone to check her daughter's locations on their family tracking app. Another parental habit that brought peace of mind. Both dots showed they were safely at home, probably already started on their homework. She made a mental note to pick up their favorite Chinese takeout over the weekend as a reward for their good grades this semester. Mr. Chen was telling her about his son's college acceptance when the store's bell chimed once more. Johnson didn't turn around, focused on pulling out her wallet while balancing the basket of supplies. She had no way of knowing that this ordinary Tuesday afternoon was about to become anything but routine. The sunlight streaming through the store's front windows had taken on the golden quality of late afternoon, casting long shadows across the linoleum floor. It was the kind of peaceful moment Johnson had learned to appreciate in her years of service, the quiet before the storm, though she didn't know it yet. As she waited for Mr. Chen to ring up her items, Johnson mentally reviewed her daughter's schedule for the week. Lisa's science project was due Thursday, and Amy had basketball practice tomorrow. Being a single parent in law enforcement meant staying organized was crucial. She'd learned to balance the unpredictable nature of her job with the stable routine her daughters needed. The total came to $42.87, and Johnson reached for her credit card. The familiar motion was interrupted by a sharp voice from behind her, a voice that would mark the beginning of an incident that would soon make headlines across the county and spark important conversations about bias in law enforcement. Little did Johnson know that her simple trip to the convenience store would become a testament to her professionalism, strength, and the ongoing challenges faced by law enforcement officers of color. The next few minutes would test everything she stood for: her dignity, her authority, and her unwavering commitment to justice, even when she found herself on the unexpected side of an accusation. The hands on the store's wall clock showed 5:47 p.m. In just moments, Sheriff Maria Johnson's ordinary Tuesday afternoon would transform into an extraordinary demonstration of grace under pressure, revealing both the persistent reality of prejudice and the power of truth to overcome it. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot of Quick Stop convenience store in Riverside County. Sheriff Maria Johnson let out a tired sigh as she pulled her silver Honda into an empty spot. It had been another demanding 12-hour shift, and all she wanted was to grab some essentials before heading home to her 2 teenage daughters. Like many working mothers, Johnson had mastered the art of efficiency. Still in her casual Friday attire, dark blue jeans and a navy polo shirt, she had her sheriff's badge securely clipped to her belt, a habit ingrained after 15 years on the force. Her dark hair was neatly pulled back in a practical bun, and despite the long day, her alert eyes continued scanning her surroundings, another habit that came with the job. The convenience store was a regular stop for Johnson. As a single mom working in law enforcement, quick meals and grab-and-go items had become a necessary part of life. The store's owner, Mr. Chen, had known her for years, since she was a rookie deputy patrolling this very neighborhood. Back then, she'd stop by during her night shifts for coffee and friendly conversation. As she stepped out of her car, Johnson's phone buzzed with a text from her daughter Lisa. "Mom, don't forget the project supplies." Johnson smiled, remembering her promise to pick up poster board and markers for Lisa's science presentation. It was these simple moments of normalcy that she cherished most, being just a mom helping with homework, despite the weight of her badge and responsibilities. The electronic bell chimed as Johnson pushed open the glass door. The familiar scent of fresh coffee and just-baked cookies welcomed her. 2 teenage boys were huddled near the slushy machine, while an elderly couple examined the greeting cards display. Mr. Chen's wife was restocking the candy aisle, and she gave Johnson a warm wave of recognition. "The usual coffee," Mrs. Chen called out with a knowing smile. "Yes, please. And some of those cookies too, if they're fresh," Johnson replied, grabbing a shopping basket. She headed toward the school supplies section first, mentally checking off items from her daughter's list. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as she compared different brands of markers, wanting to make sure she got the right ones for Lisa's project. Johnson had worked hard to get where she was, breaking barriers as one of the few female sheriffs in the county. She'd earned her position through dedication, integrity, and an unwavering commitment to protecting her community. Her fellow officers respected her leadership style, firm but fair, always ready to mentor younger deputies and build bridges with the community she served. As she reached for a pack of poster board, Johnson noticed a young mother struggling with a fussy toddler near the dairy section. The scene brought back memories of her own early days of parenthood, balancing night shifts with diaper changes and bedtime stories. She'd learned to cherish even the challenging moments, knowing they shaped both her parenting and her approach to law enforcement. The store was quieter now, with just the soft background music and the hum of refrigerators filling the air. Johnson added a few more items to her basket: milk, bread, and her daughter's favorite snacks. She checked her watch, knowing she needed to get home soon to help with homework and start dinner. Despite the exhaustion creeping in, she looked forward to hearing about her girls' day at school. What Johnson didn't know was that this routine stop would soon turn into something far from ordinary. As she moved toward the beverage aisle, the store's bell chimed again, announcing new customers. Among them was someone who would challenge not just her patience, but the very respect her badge had earned over 15 years of dedicated service. Her mind was on tomorrow's schedule: a morning meeting with her deputies, followed by community outreach at the local high school. Johnson believed in preventive policing, in building relationships before problems arose. It was why she regularly spoke at schools, helping young people see beyond the badge to the human wearing it.